My name is Emily Carter, and for 6 years, I lived in the shadow of a dream. A quiet, persistent dream named Grace. My husband Daniel and I married young, full of plans and faith in time. We thought starting a family would be easy, natural, even. But life, I've learned, rarely moves the way we expect. It tests you, reshapes you, breaks you in places you didn't know could break. After years of fertility treatments, and after losing our first pregnancy in a way that nearly hollowed me out completely, we finally made it to this moment. Our little girl was due any day, and for once, everything seemed calm. That night, it was raining, one of those early September downpours that soaks the world quiet. I was already awake when the pain hit. Not a dull ache or cramp. This was something else. A stabbing, tightening pull deep in my abdomen, sudden and brutal. I gasped. Daniel stirred beside me, his hand reaching out instinctively, eyes not fully open yet. But I knew. I didn't have to say it, but I did anyway. Something's wrong. I saw the sleep vanish from his face. He jumped up, grabbing clothes, his phone, my hospital bag. I tried to stand, but my knees buckled. He caught me. I saw his hands shake as he steadied me and realized he was trying to hide it. I didn't have the energy to reassure him. The drive to St. Joseph's was a blur of lights smeared by rain and the sound of my breath, short and uneven. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and the other reaching across to touch my leg, as if contact alone might keep me tethered. He kept saying things, almost there, stay with me, you're okay, but I wasn't listening. I was counting the seconds between waves of pain, each one sharper than the last, and praying she was still moving inside me. At the hospital, I barely remember being helped into the wheelchair. But I remember the nurse's eyes widening when she saw the blood. The way she silently hit a button on the wall. Within seconds, I was being rushed down the corridor, past familiar check-in desks and maternity posters, straight into a triage room. The doors swung open, cold air and white light swallowing me whole. Daniel tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him. We need to assess first, she said. He hesitated, then nodded, but I caught the flicker of fear on his face before the door shut between us. Inside, everything moved fast. Hands pulled my gown up. Cold gel. Straps on my belly. Heart monitors. Blood pressure cuffs. A voice kept asking questions, how far along? First pregnancy? History of bleeding? I answered automatically, eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles. One of the nurses hovered over the monitor, frowning. She moved the Doppler probe, then moved it again. And again. Her jaw tightened. Still no sound. I felt a cold sweat break across my neck. My fingers gripped the side rails of the bed. My heart thudded louder than the machine's. The nurse didn't say anything, but she exchanged a glance with the tech beside her. Just a glance, but it was everything. It was the same look I'd seen once before in a funeral home, when something had gone terribly wrong behind the scenes, but no one wanted to alarm the family. That look, tight-lipped, urgent, restrained, told me what no words could. I wanted to ask if they could hear her heartbeat, but my voice felt trapped somewhere beneath the fear pressing on my chest. The door opened again. A doctor entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-rimmed glasses and a presence that felt too heavy for a maternity ward. He introduced himself, but I didn't catch the name. His voice was calm but clipped, like he was trying to hide urgency behind bedside manners. We're going to run a few more tests, he said. But I already knew. Something wasn't right. Something had shifted. I could feel it, not just in my body, but in the air around me. The way the nurses moved, too quiet. The machines, too still. The fluorescent lights above me hummed louder than anyone's voice. I was waiting for someone to say what I already feared. And then, behind the curtain, I heard a whisper. Placental abruption. 2 words. Not meant for me. But they landed like a hammer. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I didn't need a medical degree to understand it was bad. I saw the face of one nurse drain pale, and another reach for a different set of tools. My mind raced. My body tensed. I felt a pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. Where was Daniel? I tried to lift my head, but the pain pushed it back down. My mouth was dry. My fingers kept searching for something to hold onto. That's when the doctor returned, flanked by 2 other staff members. His expression had changed. No more rehearsed calm. This was different. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the bed and looked directly at me. I need to speak to you and your husband, privately. And that was when I knew this was no longer just a complication. This was something else. Something life-changing. Something dangerous. As he turned to step outside and bring Daniel in, I noticed, just for a second, his hand trembled. And that was all it took to send a bolt of cold through my spine. We were running out of time. Daniel entered the room like someone waking into a storm, eyes wide, movements tight, breathing faster than normal but trying to look calm for me. I could see right through it. The doctor, who I now knew was Dr. Carter, not related to me, closed the curtain behind him. The nurse stepped aside, folding her arms, and the room seemed to pull in on itself, like it was bracing for impact. I felt suddenly colder. The gel on my skin had long since dried, but I hadn't even noticed. All I could feel now was the tension in the air. Dr. Carter's eyes moved between us, studying our faces, our hands, mine clenched, Daniel's half raised as if he wanted to hold me but didn't know if he was allowed to. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. He took a breath before speaking. Emily, Daniel, we're seeing signs of a placental abruption. That's when the placenta separates from the uterus before delivery. It's rare, and in this case, it's severe. I stared at him, not quite registering the words. Placenta. Separation. Rare. Severe. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It means your baby isn't getting the oxygen and nutrients she needs. And your body is reacting. The pain, the bleeding, they're symptoms of something more dangerous happening inside. We're also seeing signs of uterine rupture. Daniel flinched. What? That can't, she had no symptoms before tonight. Dr. Carter nodded slowly. Sometimes, there are no warning signs. You've had fertility surgeries in the past, correct? I nodded numbly. There could have been scar tissue. Weak spots. It's hard to predict. But right now, the uterus appears compromised, and the baby's heart rate is dropping. He paused, as if weighing whether to say the next part out loud. We need to act. Immediately. How bad is it? Daniel asked, his voice tighter now. Dr. Carter looked at him, then at me. And for the first time, his professionalism cracked just a little. There's a high risk of hemorrhage. Massive hemorrhage. For both mother and child. We're preparing the OR now. But I need you to understand, there's a real chance we may not be able to save both. The words didn't make sense at first. Not because I didn't understand them, but because I refused to. I had walked into this hospital expecting to meet my daughter, to hold her. I had never imagined it would come down to choosing who gets to live. What are you saying? Daniel asked, his tone somewhere between disbelief and anger. I'm saying that, in the next few minutes, we may need a decision. If things escalate the way we expect, we'll be forced to prioritize one life over another. I could feel my lungs tightening. I looked at Daniel. He wasn't crying, but his eyes had lost focus. Like he'd left the room without moving. We're still trying everything, Dr. Carter continued. We've called in our top surgeons and the NICU team is on standby. But if it comes down to it, Emily, Daniel, you need to tell us now. Who do we save? Silence filled the room like smoke. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. But something in me, some part of me deeper than fear, knew the answer. I turned to Daniel. He was already looking at me, waiting for a sign, a cue, anything to guide him through the impossible. I said it without hesitation. Save her. My voice was steadier than I expected, but inside, I was breaking apart. Daniel shook his head. Emily, no. No, there has to be another way. If there's not, I said, my eyes locking on his, then she gets to live. He opened his mouth again, maybe to argue, maybe to beg me to reconsider. But before any words came out, I felt a searing pain ripple through my body. And then, the world tilted. The ceiling lights blurred. My teeth clenched involuntarily. A burning pressure surged through my chest. Then my arms. Then nothing. I heard someone scream, Daniel, I think. The monitors went wild. A nurse shouted for a crash cart. Another called out codes I didn't understand. The curtain flew open. More people rushed in. Someone pulled the bed brakes. I couldn't feel my hands. I couldn't feel anything. And still, I remember the look on Daniel's face as he signed the consent forms. Not grief. Not even fear. It was something else. Something hollow. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was the operating room doors swinging shut behind me, and Daniel left behind in the hallway, eyes glued to the clock on the wall. Waiting for time to slow down. Waiting for someone to come back. There's a strange silence in unconsciousness. It's not like sleep. It doesn't feel soft or protective. It feels like falling into a blankness that presses against your skin, weightless and heavy all at once. That's where I was, suspended in a place with no light, no time, no sound, until something pulled me back. Not gently. Not gradually. But like being yanked up from deep water without warning. My chest burned. My ears rang. Somewhere far off, someone was shouting my name. Emily, stay with us. Emily. I couldn't move. Couldn't respond. But I heard them. Felt the cold bite of air against my skin as the surgical team surrounded me. I caught glimpses between shadows, bright lights, masked faces, machines. A woman above me counting. A man pressing hard on my abdomen. I wanted to scream, but my mouth was dry, useless. It was like waking up inside someone else's nightmare. Then I heard it again. That sentence. She said save the baby. And suddenly everything came back, the pain, the blood, the decision. Grace. I forced my eyes open for half a second and saw Dr. Carter, eyes locked on something out of view. He wasn't giving instructions anymore, he was listening. Listening too intently, like he'd just been told something that changed everything. I turned my head slightly and saw Daniel through the smaller window, his face pale, hands pressed to the glass. He didn't look like the man who used to sing to my belly every night. He looked like someone whose world had just cracked open. And then the pain came back in full. My body seized. I couldn't stop it. Arms, legs, everything jolted like electricity had been poured into my veins. The monitor screamed. Someone shouted seizing, and everything exploded into motion. I wasn't aware of the scalpel. Or the first incision. I only remember the moment right before, when Dr. Carter said, "We're losing both." His voice wasn't calm anymore. It cracked on the word both. That's when the anesthesiologist, a young man with wide eyes and trembling fingers, stepped forward. "We tried the internal compression. Now." "What?" one nurse asked. "It's not standard in obstetrics," another added. "I don't care," the anesthesiologist snapped. "You want to stand here and watch them both die?" No one answered. That silence, that split-second pause, was all the agreement he needed. And then chaos turned to calculation. Orders flew. Tools changed hands. My blood pressure was dropping fast. Grace's heart rate, they said, was almost non-existent. Daniel, they told me later, signed the final consent form with his head down, his hand barely able to grip the pen. A nurse had to help steady it. He didn't cry. Not then. But one of them, a surgical tech named Marissa, said she saw something else. As she stepped away to make space near the entrance, she found a younger nurse standing in the corner, back against the wall, silent tears streaking her mask. No sound. No motion. Just crying. Quietly, like someone mourning before the loss had been confirmed. Daniel saw her. Their eyes met. And in that moment, he told me later, he stopped hearing everything. No more beeping monitors. No more voices calling stats. No more footsteps across the floor. Just silence. I wasn't there to see it, but I can feel it now when I think back. That split between choice and consequence. Between what we believe we're strong enough to carry, and what we're forced to live with. I made the decision. I told them to save her. And even as my body gave out beneath the weight of it, some part of me held on. Not for myself, but for her. If I was going to go, I needed to know that Grace had a chance. That Daniel wouldn't be left with nothing but memory and grief. They moved quickly then. A nurse called out the time. Another counted down the meds. Dr. Carter steadied his hands over the incision site. One of the assistants whispered a prayer. And as the scalpel pierced my skin, the only thought in my mind was this: let her live. Not me. Her. The world disappeared again, but this time, I welcomed it. The blackness was different this time. Not empty. Not silent. There was a pulse to it, like distant thunder rolling just beyond the edge of hearing. I wasn't floating anymore, I was sinking. Every breath felt like it had to fight its way out of concrete. But something inside me, some stubborn, instinctive fragment, refused to let go. I couldn't see, couldn't move, but I was still there. And I wasn't alone. I could feel her. Grace. She wasn't crying. Not yet. But she was close. When I came to, everything was white and too bright. A different room, cooler, quieter. The whirring of machines filled the air. I blinked once, slow, like the motion itself needed permission. A nurse noticed and came quickly to my side, her face softening as she leaned down. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was gentle. Careful. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. She offered a sip of water through a sponge-tipped stick. My lips barely responded. I managed a whisper. "The baby?" She hesitated. Just enough for the fear to rise again. "They're working on her," she said. "She's in the NICU. Your husband's with her now. Working on her. Not holding her. Not feeding her. Not she's okay. Just working." My body felt heavy. Every inch of me ached, but especially low across my abdomen. That's when I realized they'd done the surgery. The incision was there. I could feel the pressure, the dull burn beneath the bandages. A nurse confirmed it later: emergency C-section, uterine rupture, nearly 4 liters of blood lost. They had to transfuse twice during the procedure and again afterward. They weren't sure I'd wake up. Daniel didn't leave the NICU once in the first 16 hours. They told me he stood behind the glass, one hand pressed to it like if he could just will her to breathe, she would. I imagined him whispering to her the way he used to whisper to me on our worst nights, words not meant to fix anything, just to keep the pieces from falling apart. I saw him for the first time 2 days later. He came into the room with that cautious, too careful expression. The look people wear when they're not sure what you can handle. "Hey," he said, stepping close. I tried to smile. My face barely moved. He sat beside me and took my hand. She's fighting." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Fighting. That meant she hadn't won yet. That meant it wasn't over. I turned my head slowly. "I want to see her." His jaw clenched. "You can't. Not yet. You're still too weak." I closed my eyes. My chest rose with shallow breath. Did she cry? It was the only question that mattered. Not stats, not oxygen levels, not weight or condition. Did my daughter cry? Daniel's eyes welled instantly. He nodded, barely able to keep his voice steady. She did. Not right away, but she did. And that's when I cried. For the first time since waking. I let it come, the tears sliding down my temples into my hair. I didn't make a sound. Just let it happen. The doctors came and went. Their words were cautious, full of probability and possibility. Grace had been born unresponsive. No pulse. No cry. The NICU team had worked on her for nearly 3 minutes before they got a flicker of a heartbeat. They'd placed her in a temperature-controlled incubator. Tubes, monitors, wires. Her tiny body looked more machine than human, Daniel said. But she was alive. I whispered her name over and over in the quiet moments when no one else was there. Like I was trying to call her back to me, remind her I was still here. That I hadn't left. That we were still connected. The nurses warned me not to strain myself. Not to cry too much. To rest. But I couldn't stop thinking about the moment when I said, "Save her." I replayed it constantly. Not because I doubted it, but because I needed to hold on to the clarity I felt when I said it. I didn't choose to die. I chose to let her live. There's a difference. In the days that followed, I watched the clock constantly. Every hour that passed was a small miracle. The nurses started saying things like stable and improving. And even though my body was still fighting its own war, fevers, transfusions, recovery, I only wanted one thing. To hear her cry again. To see her. To know that the decision I made in that impossible moment led to something more than a memory. Something real. They wouldn't let me walk. Not yet. I was still too pale, still too weak. But I begged. Whispered it through cracked lips until one of the nurses, a woman named Leah with warm eyes and a firm voice, finally gave in, on one condition: I had to be wheeled. So there I was, 5 days after the surgery, being pushed slowly down the fluorescent-lit hallway, each bump in the floor sending fire through my stitched belly. I wore a gown that didn't close right in the back and held tightly to the small 4-pole clinking beside me. My body felt hollow, but I was going to see her. The NICU was quieter than I expected. No crying, no chaos. Just the steady hum of machines, soft murmurs, and the faint beeping that marked each fragile, living second. When we passed through the double doors, my breath caught. Rows of incubators. Tubes. Tiny bundles inside plastic boxes. I hadn't prepared myself. You can't. Leah pushed me past the first 2 rows and stopped in front of one near the far wall. I didn't recognize her at first. My Grace. Her skin was dusky. Her limbs thinner than I imagined. There were sensors on her chest, a breathing tube down her throat, and bandages around her tiny wrists. But she was there. And she was moving. Only barely, but enough. A small, involuntary twitch of the fingers. The flutter of a foot. I reached out, hand trembling, but stopped just short of touching the glass. Leah handed me a sanitized glove. I slid it on. Slipped my hand through the small opening and gently laid my palm over her back. Her skin was warm. Fragile as wet paper. But real. I whispered her name. She didn't respond, but I didn't expect her to. I just needed to say it aloud, to connect the word to the body in front of me. Grace. My Grace. That moment, those first seconds, felt like a different kind of birth. Not one of blood and pain, but of acceptance. Of awe. I wasn't afraid then. Not of her tubes, not of her silence. I was only full, overflowing, with something deeper than love. Something primal. Sacred. Then I saw Daniel. He was standing on the other side of the glass, eyes red, hair disheveled. He didn't speak. Just nodded, his hands shoved deep in his pockets like he was holding himself together by force. I knew he hadn't slept. Had barely eaten. But he was there. He hadn't left her side once. Later, he told me about the hallway outside the OR. How he stood there for what felt like days, the red light above the door flickering off and on like a cruel joke. How nurses rushed past him without speaking. How no one would meet his eyes. Then finally, Dr. Carter. He came out alone. Slow. Not solemn, not smiling. Just unreadable. Daniel stood up, nearly knocking over the chair. "Are they okay?" he asked. His voice cracked, raw from hours of silence. Dr. Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. Not firm. Not comforting. Just there. "We got them back," he said. That was it. Not they're okay. Not they're safe. Just, we got them back. Because for a moment, we hadn't been here at all. Not me. Not Grace. There was a space, a window of time, where we were gone. And someone had pulled us back. That truth lived in Daniel's eyes when he looked at me across that NICU room. It never left. Even when he smiled. Even when he kissed my forehead and whispered, "She's strong. Like her mother." Even then, I saw it. We both carried it now. That we had almost lost everything. That silence we lived through, the hallway, the hours afterward, it doesn't go away. It hums beneath everything. In every monitor beep, every flutter of her breath, every shift of her chest as the machines helped her lungs do what they still couldn't quite manage alone. Some silences are peaceful. But not that one. That was the cruelest kind of silence. The kind that waits. That watches. That leaves room for grief in case it needs to return. There are things no one tells you about surviving. About what it means to come back from that kind of edge. People speak about miracles, about strength and grace and divine timing, but they rarely talk about the moments in between, the ones that nearly undo it all. I found out later just how close we came to being names carved into memory instead of voices in a room. Dr. Carter visited me on the 6th night. I was stronger by then, strong enough to sit up without help, to eat in slow bites, to ask the questions I hadn't been able to voice before. He pulled a chair beside my bed and sat like a man carrying too much in his shoulders. "You want the truth?" he asked. "Yes." He rubbed his hands together once before speaking. "You lost almost half your blood volume. We had to transfuse while we operated, and even then, your heart nearly stopped. We were seconds from calling a code." I nodded slowly. "And Grace?" He looked away for a moment. "She flatlined." I felt it in my chest, not a sting, not a shock, but a hollowing. Like the truth carved something out of me as it entered. "She had no pulse for almost 3 minutes," he continued. "There was a moment when both of you were unresponsive. The surgical team split. Half focused on you. The others," he paused. "We were going to let go." The room felt too still, too sharp. I didn't breathe. "You were both gone," he said quietly. "And we weren't going to get you back." "What changed?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Dr. Nguyen. He's new, an anesthesiology resident. Young. Too young to know when to accept the end of something. He had been monitoring your vitals, and while we were stabilizing you, he noticed something with the baby's oxygen levels, something small, something most of us missed. He pushed for a maneuver we've never used in an obstetric emergency. It was textbook. Hypothetical. What did he do?" I asked. Dr. Carter exhaled. He used an internal compression protocol typically reserved for trauma surgery, abdominal pressure manipulation to redirect circulation, combined with high volume transfusion and external pacing. We had nothing left to try. So we let him lead. I closed my eyes, imagining it. My lifeless body on that table. Grace, silent, still, no heartbeat. One young doctor with shaking hands staring to try something no one else believed would work. And it did? I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, his voice trembled. "She came back." First a flicker. Then a heartbeat. Then yours strengthened. It was the most impossible hour I've seen in my 25 years of medicine. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The weight of it all pressed against my ribs. Why didn't you tell us sooner? I whispered. We didn't know if it would hold, he admitted. Sometimes the body rallies only to fail again. But you, both of you kept fighting. I looked toward the hallway, toward the direction of the NICU, where Grace lay under soft blue light, her chest rising and falling with each fragile breath. We almost lost her, I said. You almost lost each other, he corrected. But you didn't. He left not long after, but the silence he left behind was loud. I lay there replaying everything. What if Dr. Nguyen hadn't spoken up? What if they had let go? What if we were one breath short? I was filled with a strange mix of grief and gratitude, grief for how close we came, gratitude for a risk taken by someone barely out of training. Later that night, Daniel came in and sat beside me. He took my hand without a word, his eyes darker than I remembered. You knew, I said. He nodded. They told me the next morning. And you didn't say anything? He looked down at our hands. I didn't want to relive it. I just wanted to look forward. I squeezed his fingers. Me too. And yet, part of me would always live in that impossible hour, the hour we both nearly slipped away. They called it the impossible hour, but to me, it felt like the moment the world cracked open just wide enough for a second chance to slip through. I heard the term from one of the night nurses during my 4th visit to the NICU. She didn't know I was listening when she whispered it to a colleague. She just said, "That Carter baby? She and her mom are the impossible hour." And then she looked over at me and smiled like I was something rare. I didn't know how to respond, so I smiled back and turned to look at Grace, my daughter, my second chance. Her skin had more color now. Her arms moved with just enough energy to make the wires twitch gently when she shifted. The oxygen tubes were still there, but the ventilator had been downgraded to CPAP. Her eyes were still closed most of the time, but she'd begun to respond to light. They told me that was good. That was hope. I was allowed to touch her longer now, my gloved hand resting lightly on her back, stroking gently between her shoulder blades. The nurses had shown me how not to overstimulate, how to offer presence without pressure. One afternoon, I whispered a lullaby, and she moved her tiny head toward the sound. Just that. A turn. But it unraveled something deep inside me. A signal. A connection. She knew I was there. The next day, I was strong enough to hold her. They transferred her from the incubator to my arms using a carefully choreographed series of movements that looked more like a science experiment than a moment of bonding. But when they laid her against my chest, and her warm cheek pressed into my collarbone, time stopped. She was so small. Too small. And yet she was all there. Breathing, alive, real. Her breath made tiny clouds against my hospital gown. Her fingers twitched near my collar. Her weight, a few pounds, barely noticeable, felt heavier than anything I'd ever carried. Daniel was beside me. One hand on my shoulder, the other trembling as it reached out to brush her head. "She's here," I whispered. He nodded, speechless. In that moment, there were no machines, no numbers, no charts. Just us. The three of us. After everything. After blood and decisions and the kind of silence that nearly swallowed us whole, there we were. Alive. Later, we met Dr. Nguyen. He walked into the NICU with the humility of someone who didn't expect to be thanked. He looked exhausted, still wearing a pair of scrubs that didn't quite fit. When Daniel introduced me, the young doctor's eyes dropped to Grace and stayed there. "I didn't do it alone," he said before I could even speak. "Everyone played a part." "You spoke when no one else did," I told him. "That's not nothing." He looked at me for a long second, then nodded. "She reminded me of my sister. When she was born, she was premature. My parents were told she wouldn't survive. But she did. So you believed this one could too?" I had to try. I watched his hands. They were still. Not a tremor. Not a flicker. But something in the way he stood told me he hadn't yet processed what had happened. I wanted to say more, to explain how grateful I was, how his decision had altered the course of our lives. But the words felt too thin. So I said the only thing I could. "Thank you." He nodded again, more softly this time, and turned to leave. That night, I was transferred out of ICU. I walked slowly, but unassisted, to my new room. I passed the hallway where Daniel had waited during the surgery. I paused at the clock mounted on the wall. I didn't know how long he had stood there. But I knew what it had cost him. I sat in bed and closed my eyes. My body still ached. My scars were still fresh. But when I reached for the memory of that first hour after Grace was born, I didn't feel pain. I felt awe. Not just at the science or the courage of one resident, but at the quiet resilience of a body that refused to give up. At the child who found her way back to breath. At the moment I woke up and asked the only question that mattered, did she cry? That question had echoed through the room, and every person who heard it felt it in their bones. Because it wasn't really about sound. It was about life. About presence. About proof. She had cried. And somehow, so had I. We both had found our way back. The first time Grace opened her eyes, it was for less than 2 seconds. I was sitting beside her incubator, humming softly one of those melodies Daniel used to play on his old guitar before we gave up trying to keep it in tune. The NICU lights were dimmed, and the steady rhythm of beeping monitors had become a strange sort of lullaby. I wasn't expecting anything. I had stopped hoping for sudden changes. I'd learned that progress in the NICU came in millimeters, not leaps. But then it happened. Her eyelids fluttered once, then lifted, just long enough for me to see the faintest glimmer of blue. She blinked, then closed them again, her brow twitching slightly like the light had been too much. It was barely a moment, but it felt like everything. My breath caught. My hand on the glass didn't move. "Grace," I whispered. "I see you." That night, I returned to my room lighter, and Daniel said he could tell. He was reading a hospital flyer about long-term NICU care, trying to sound calm as he recited statistics. I let him finish. Then I told him about her eyes. He didn't say anything for a long time. Just nodded slowly, folded the flyer in half, and tucked it into the drawer beside the bed. "They said she might open them soon," he said. She did. 2 days later, the doctor allowed us to do skin-to-skin again. They warned us she was still fragile, that any kind of stress, even joy, could tip her oxygen levels. But they knew we needed it. She needed it too. They placed her on my chest gently, arranging wires and tubes so nothing would be pulled. Her body barely weighed more than a book, but I could feel the heat of her skin, the rhythm of her breath. Daniel sat beside me, his hand on my leg. We didn't speak. Then, out of nowhere, she made a sound. It wasn't a cry. Not yet. It was more like a soft, broken coo. The faintest vocalization. But it cracked something open inside me. I looked at Daniel. He was already crying. "She's trying," he said. That night, just as we were settling into a cautious rhythm, the monitor beeped in a tone I hadn't heard before. A nurse rushed in. Grace's oxygen saturation had plummeted. Within seconds, her body went still again. The tiny rise and fall of her chest, the one I had learned to live by, was gone. And the silence returned. The silence hit like a blow. That terrible, suffocating quiet after the monitor let out a single, piercing alarm. I froze. Daniel stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. The nurse who had been documenting Grace's vitals dropped everything and hit a red button on the wall. Within seconds, the room filled. A crash team, 2 respiratory therapists, a neonatal specialist I hadn't seen before, all of them speaking fast, focused, urgent. They pushed us back. A curtain pulled. I couldn't see her anymore. "Please," I said, but my voice was useless. I stood on legs still healing from surgery, the ache in my abdomen flaring, but I couldn't move. My body locked itself in place. All I could do was listen to the beeps, the voices, the code numbers. And then, nothing. Not for long. Maybe 2 seconds. Maybe 3. But it was enough. I crumpled into the chair behind me, one hand on my belly where the incision still burned, the other reaching for something that wasn't there. Daniel paced. Then stopped. Then paced again. His hands balled into fists, then opened again, fingers twitching like they were trying to grab onto something invisible. One of the nurses stepped outside the curtain. Her name tag read Marla. She was middle-aged, calm in a way that felt lived in. She looked at Daniel and shook her head once. "Not yet," she said. "Don't give up yet." It was all she said. Then she went back inside. Those words became our lifeline. Not yet. We clung to them while the team worked. We later learned Grace had gone into acute respiratory failure due to a pulmonary infection that had been silently building, something even the most vigilant teams sometimes can't catch in time. Her oxygen dropped to 22%. Her color changed. Her lungs seized. The NICU team fought for 13 hours. 13 hours without rest, without sleep, barely stopping for water. Dr. Ames, the attending neonatologist, rotated shifts to stay at Grace's side. But it was one therapist, Marisol, who became the anchor. She didn't leave the room. Marisol Torres was barely 5 feet tall and moved with a stillness that made you trust her without knowing why. She stayed at Grace's bedside the entire night, adjusting ventilator settings, monitoring breath sounds, and speaking to her constantly. Not loudly. Not with panic. But as if Grace could understand. "You're doing good, little one," she'd whisper. "I'm here. You're not alone." Daniel heard her. He stood outside the NICU window for hours, watching her tend to our daughter like she was her own blood. When the sun finally rose, when the monitors began to slow back into a steady rhythm and Grace's oxygen climbed, first to 40, then 60, then 75, it was Marisol who looked up at Daniel and nodded. "We're back," she said. When I saw her hours later, she simply touched my shoulder and smiled. "She's a fighter," she whispered. Like her mother. But that morning wasn't done with us yet. While Grace was stabilizing, something shifted in me. A heat rose in my chest, sharp and fast. My vision blurred. I called for the nurse. I don't remember falling, only the sensation of being caught mid-collapse. My body, already weakened, had begun to bleed internally. A complication from the original rupture, a vessel they hadn't seen. I was rushed to imaging, then to surgery again. This time, Daniel stayed outside 2 rooms. Our daughter in one. His wife in another. Both lives on edges again, but for different reasons. He told me later that he didn't cry. Not out of strength, but because something inside him had gone numb. When a nurse tried to offer comfort, he simply stared at her and asked, "Do you believe in impossible hours?" She didn't answer. Just handed him an envelope. "Someone left this for you," she said. It was unmarked. No return name. No indication of who had written it. He didn't open it. Not yet. Time disintegrated. It no longer moved in hours or minutes, but in pulses, beeps, whispers, shallow breaths, sudden alarms. That day stretched into a shapeless blur where the sun rose and set without permission, where everything depended on whether we'd see another dawn together. I was wheeled out of surgery just past 3 in the morning. My body ached in ways that couldn't be named. My abdomen, now stapled and dressed again, felt like a battlefield. They'd stopped the internal bleeding in time, barely. I was stable, but fragile. The words they used made me feel like a vase placed too close to the edge of a high shelf. Daniel sat in the corner of my room, pale, eyes sunken. He hadn't left Grace's side until they forced him to eat something. But even then, he didn't chew. He just stared at the envelope the nurse had handed him. It rested on his lap now, unopened. I asked him about Grace, but he shook his head. They're not saying much. She's holding on. Barely. Then he looked at me. I thought I was going to lose you both. His voice was steady, but something inside it cracked on that last word. Both. I'm still here, I whispered. He nodded. But we both knew what that meant now. Being here didn't mean safe. It just meant still fighting. The day passed like that, nurses coming in and out, for drips adjusted, vitals logged, and still no news that felt like relief. At some point, I drifted into sleep, not because I wanted to but because my body gave up asking for permission. When I woke, the sky outside was glowing faintly with the first signs of morning. The room was quiet. Daniel wasn't in the chair. Then I heard footsteps. He returned a moment later, holding the envelope in his hand. It's time, he said. Daniel stood at the edge of my bed with the envelope in his hand like it weighed far more than it should. His fingers ran across the seal, hesitating before breaking it. I watched his eyes as he read, how they moved quickly at first, then slowed, then stopped. He folded the letter closed without a word. Then, softly, they made it. My throat tightened. Both? He nodded. Grace stabilized. You're safe now. They said the bleeding won't return. I didn't respond. Couldn't. The tears that came weren't loud, weren't dramatic. They just happened. Sliding down my cheeks quietly while Daniel knelt beside me and placed the letter in my lap. They're letting you see her. They're taking you to the NICU in an hour. I stared at him, barely able to believe it. He kissed my forehead, then helped adjust my bed so I could sit up fully. The world outside the window was awash in the golden light of morning. But inside me, it felt like the end of a storm I'd been trapped in for years. When they wheeled me into the NICU, the nurses moved aside like they had been waiting for this moment. Grace was no longer behind glass. She was swaddled in pale green fabric, a soft cap covering her tiny head. Tubes still trailed from her side, but her eyes were open. They placed her in my arms, and for the first time since all of this began, time truly stopped. 27 seconds. That's how long no one spoke. Not Daniel. Not the nurses. Not the doctors who had once feared this moment might never come. Just us. Breathing. Alive. Together. Daniel knelt beside us and took my hand in one of his and Grace's in the other. I promise, he said quietly, I will never forget what we almost lost. And I will never take for granted what we got back. We left St. Joseph's 32 days after Grace was born. I still remember the sound the wheelchair made as it rolled down that final hallway, the soft rattle of its wheels, the echo of each rotation bouncing off the pale walls. Grace was cradled in my arms, her tiny body finally free of tubes. A nurse followed beside us, holding a discharge folder filled with instructions we already knew by heart. Daniel walked ahead, holding the car seat like it was made of glass. We didn't speak until we reached the doors. The air outside hit like something sacred. After weeks of fluorescent lights and filtered oxygen, the world felt too real. Too bright. But it was ours again. The drive home was quiet. Grace slept the whole way, tucked into her seat with a knitted blanket someone from the NICU had gifted us. Daniel kept one eye on the rearview mirror, watching her with more intensity than he had ever used on the road itself. I stared out the window, feeling both heavier and lighter than I had ever felt. We had crossed something, not a finish line, not exactly, but a threshold. We weren't the same people who had arrived at the hospital that rainy morning. At home, there were balloons on the porch. Neighbors had left flowers, food, handwritten cards. I stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping in. Grace made a soft sound in her sleep, and that alone gave me the courage to move forward. The house was the same, but I wasn't. The first week was a blur of feedings, medications, follow-up calls, and sudden, paralyzing waves of memory. My body healed slowly. Every movement reminded me of what I'd been through. But Grace was strong. Her weight increased, her breathing steadied, her eyes tracked our faces with growing curiosity. Every moment with her felt like a quiet defiance against everything we'd been told to fear. 3 weeks after we brought her home, Daniel sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop and didn't say a word. He opened a new document and typed the words, "The Grace Foundation." When I asked him what he was doing, he simply said, "We're not going to waste this." We had both felt it, this need to transform the trauma into something more. We knew what it was to be surrounded by strangers who saved your world. We knew what it meant to live in waiting rooms, to sign consent forms with trembling hands, to hear silence where a heartbeat should be. So we started making calls to hospitals, to NICUs, to families we met online, through support groups and whispered stories. We told them we wanted to fund emergency supplies, trauma kits, training for newer doctors, emotional support teams for parents who were left behind glass. We wanted to honor the impossible hour not by forgetting it, but by preparing others for it. Within 6 months, the Grace Foundation was real. Within a year, it had funded pilot programs in 3 hospitals. Daniel spoke at conferences. I met with families. We shared our story, not for pity or praise, but for purpose. On the first anniversary of Grace's birth, we received a letter in the mail. Handwritten. Neat. The return address was from the University Hospital 2 cities away. Inside, a folded piece of paper. At the top, it said simply, Dr. Nguyen. His words were careful, like they had been thought through 100 times. "You were the reason I trusted my instinct that night," he wrote. "No protocol told me to try what I tried. It was your voice. Her name. The way your husband said, 'Please.' I didn't save your lives. You gave me the courage to try." At the bottom, one final line, "I carry that night with me. Every time I step into an OR." I wept reading it. Because pain had become purpose. And purpose had become the legacy of a girl who wasn't even supposed to breathe. Grace turned 3 this morning. The sun came in through the nursery window just as it did that first day we brought her home, soft, golden, almost too perfect. I sat at the edge of her bed while she slept, watching the way her chest rose and fell with calm, steady rhythm. Her arms were splayed across the covers, her curls tangled from the night, one foot peeking out like she had already started dreaming of running. There are no machines in her room now. No monitors. No alarms. Only quiet, and the kind that brings peace, not fear. 3 years ago, we didn't know if she would take her first breath. Today, she won't stop singing. Daniel made pancakes in the shape of stars. She laughed when he spilled syrup on his shirt and tried to clean it with one of her doll blankets. Later, she climbed into my lap and asked, very seriously, "Did I used to be tiny?" I smiled. "You were the tiniest miracle I ever held." She tilted her head. "What's a miracle?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Daniel went to get it and came back holding a small package. No return address. Just our names, written in handwriting I recognized instantly. We opened it together. Inside was a photo. It was taken 2 years ago, during one of our foundation visits to a hospital in Chicago. Daniel was giving a talk to NICU staff. Grace, barely walking then, had waddled up to the stage and taken his hand mid-sentence. The audience had laughed. We hadn't known someone had captured that moment. But the real surprise was what was written on the back of the photo. In that moment, I realized something: the lives we save go on to save others. Thank you for saving mine, too. It was signed, Dr. Nguyen. Daniel stood there in silence for a long time, photo in hand. Then he walked to the fireplace and placed it beside the letter from Nguyen's first note, the one he had written after Grace's birth. We kept that letter in a frame. It sits beside a NICU donor plaque engraved with Grace's name. Every year on her birthday, we return to St. Joseph's. We bring gift baskets to the NICU, envelopes with anonymous donations, and thank you letters written to nurses who may have changed departments but are never forgotten. We walk those halls not as patients or victims, but as proof. Some of the families know our story. Some don't. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they see us, whole, standing, carrying a child who was once called unviable, and they understand what can happen when people choose not to give up. There's a ripple to every decision made in the impossible hour. And we still feel those ripples every day. When Grace coughs in her sleep and we don't panic. When Daniel pauses before crossing a hospital threshold and then steps forward anyway. When I whisper her name in the dark and remember the sound of machines flatlining and how silence once ended with a cry. People talk about miracles as if they happen apart from us. As if they descend from some unseen force and leave us changed. But I've learned something else. Miracles are made. They're made of doctors who don't follow scripts. Of nurses who cry in quiet corners but keep working. Of mothers who say save her even when they're scared they won't get to say goodbye. Of fathers who pray with clenched fists and open hearts. They're made in blood. In instinct. In courage. Today, Grace helped me pack another donation for the foundation. She placed her favorite stuffed bear in the box and said, "Give it to a baby who's scared." I kissed her forehead. "You're amazing, you know that?" She nodded like it was obvious. "I'm Grace." Yes. She is. Because sometimes, the most unbelievable miracles are made by human hands.